is a text I have to admit I've tried to avoid. I've been using this book as a launching point for this sermon series, The God We Can Know. And I was originally thinking I would do a study with it as well. I borrowed a copy of the book and the DVD from Grand Blanc, and then I realized I had to change the order around for World Communion Sunday and All Saints Day, and then I thought, you know what? Great, I get to skip this one. Because, this is one of those passages, the first half of it, that most of my life I've heard used to exclude. The language, no one comes to the Father except through me, has been used, at least in my life, to exclude. The theology that, well, if you don't believe exactly the way I do, Jesus won't accept you. And if Jesus doesn't accept you, you're going to go to hell. Or the image that if you don't have that conversion experience, that born again experience, then you're really not a Christian. And well, you don't really believe. All of us as preachers tend to avoid certain scriptures that we don't like. Scriptures that have been used or have been used to create bad theology. We just tend to avoid. Even those who are lectionary preachers, that we have options. In some churches, we have no options. There are churches that have strictly lectionary texts, but there are 4 of them, and you can decide which one of those 4 you're going to preach on. You don't have to preach on all 4. So you can still avoid certain scriptures. But in researching this text, I realized I needed to embrace it. That I needed to come to terms with it. But it was funny because one of my favorite commentaries that I go to every week, they went the first 5 verses and then went to verse 9. And they didn't deal with these couple of verses. And I thought, okay, so I'm not alone. But the author of this little book really challenged me. He wrote it, and he said, just because you ignore it doesn't mean Jesus didn't say it. Darn it. This author, who is a United Methodist from Indiana, also went on to say that he didn't like the theology of this exclusion either. So he challenged me and challenged himself to dive deeper and to understand where this passage could be coming from and to find a new meaning, a grace-filled meaning in these words. So we're going to start this morning with a deeper dive into historical context. So we need to lay out a timeline. Approximately 30 AD, Jesus is crucified, buried, rose, and ascended. Okay? So the church is born. There's about 20 years Paul writes his letters. The disciples go out somewhere around 60. Mark writes the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel that's written. In the 60s, Rome starts punishing Jerusalem, and a war breaks out, and in 70, Jerusalem falls to the Romans, and the temple is destroyed, and it's never rebuilt. So if you go to Jerusalem today and you see the temple wall, the Temple Mount, that's all that's left from that destruction at 70. The same time, in the burning of Rome in 64, Nero blames the Christians, only there's a lot more historical evidence that probably he burned it himself, but he chooses to blame the Christians, this group of new believers. And there were many Christians who didn't join the Jews to fight to try to keep Jerusalem safe. And so here in this 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s time frame, the Christians, this baby birth of a church, they're being persecuted on all sides. They're no longer accepted in the Jewish community, but the Romans don't want anything to do with them, and nobody wants them. And in this, around 95, all these dates are questionable. Okay? They're just good guesses. So don't take this as it was 95 that he wrote it. It's about 95. John, or someone, wrote the Gospel of John. He may have been the disciple John. It may have been a disciple of the disciple of John, the disciple John, chose to write down these intimate conversations. And much of the Gospel of John are intimate conversations between Jesus and his disciples. We've talked about that before. Jesus is not often in the Gospel of John talking to huge crowds of people. Often it's small groups of people or just his disciples. In this writing, he's in the upper room. It's following the Passover dinner. It's following the washing of the feet. And Jesus is trying to fill them up, giving them as much as he can, preparing for them for what's to come. Because within 12 hours, Jesus is going to be arrested, tried, and crucified. And it's in these beginning verses of chapter 14 that we hear at many funerals. Don't be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare, is how this Common English Bible translates it. What Jesus was talking about in this section is this idea to abide with God forever. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. To abide with God. Like a branch. That's the same word. The Greek word is being used here. It's used the next chapter. This same big context of this conversation when Jesus is shoving words and thoughts and getting as much as he possibly can into the disciples before he's arrested. He's saying, in heaven, where there's room for you, where you will abide with God forever, I'm going to get you there. I'm going to get you there. But Thomas, who historically we think of as doubting Thomas, who's actually just brave enough to ask the question, says, "How do we know where you're going?" Jesus replies, "I'm the way. I'm the way. I'm the way, the truth, and the life." Remember, Jesus at this time wasn't trying to create a new religion, but a revitalization within the Jewish culture. He was trying to get his disciples to think in terms of connecting through Jesus to God. John is writing these words, I believe, to try to get them to think, in difficult times, remember, when everybody is against you, through me, you are in direct connection with the God who created it all, with the great I am. Gail O'Day, a New Testament scholar, reminds us that we have to engage sometimes when we read the New Testament in theological imagination. Because we sit here in our first world, in a world where being a Christian isn't hard. Nobody's gonna come after us. We don't have to worry for our lives because we're Christian. It's safe, it's normal, it's easy in our world, regardless of what the news media may tell us. We don't need John 14:6 to affirm that it's okay to be Christian. But think of what John 14:6 would mean to you if you were fighting for your life as a Christian. Think of what these passages would mean to you if you didn't know whether or not tomorrow was going to be your last day on earth because the emperor could come in at any time and decide you were going to be the next one fed to the lions. We don't have to worry about that, do we? We don't. We don't have to worry about hiding to worship. We live in a culture where we are free to worship God. But John was writing to a group of people that weren't free. They were struggling to survive, to stay alive in the midst of persecution. I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. But it doesn't yet clear us to the second half of that statement in 14:6. No one comes to the Father but through me. The part that I still struggle with because I've had it used against me. When people I love say to me, well, you obviously don't really believe in Jesus because you're a girl and girls shouldn't preach. I had somebody write that on a Facebook post recently. Somebody I love dearly. You know what? I had to let it go. But you know what? There's grace. There's a story of C.S. Lewis walked in late to a gathering of religious leaders who were arguing. We like to do that a lot. They were debating the distinctiveness of Christianity, and he walked in and he said, "Oh, that's easy." And they all looked at him like, "Yeah, right." And he said, "It is." All these highly educated, pompous men looked at him with derision and said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "It is. It's grace." And they looked at him. Grace is what is unique in the Christian faith. Grace is what allows the openness of the statement that no one comes to the Father but by me. Because grace is unique in the church. Because salvation is not dependent upon anything that I do. It's not based on my merit. I can't earn it. It's a gift. It's grace. And God can appropriate God's gift to whoever God wants. And if somebody wants to say, God can't give you the gift and the calling to be a preacher, I said, wanna bet? Because God's bigger than that. Because God's bigger than that. I'm not saying that knowing and accepting and believing aren't necessary. But we have a God of second chances. And not just second chances, but infinitive chances. And God offers us an opportunity for grace, even before we know it. My favorite image in most any of the parables is the parable that's known most often as the prodigal son. And what I love about it is the father. And it's an image that's often not talked about. Because it says, the father saw the son when he was a long way away and ran to greet him. Which meant he was looking for him. He didn't know when the son was coming home, but he was looking for him. God is looking for us and runs to us and offers us grace. It's grace that allows that statement to be inclusive. John Wesley called it prevenient grace. Grace that is given to us before we can even acknowledge it. So Jesus is. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. But there is grace. So this week, as we conclude, we have talked about all of the I am statements. I invite you to remember that God is the great I am, a mystery, a presence in our lives at all times. The bread of life, the light of the world, the gate and the great shepherd, the true vine, the resurrection, the life, the way, the truth, and the life, and is always open to you.